Hello there, Ben Bowers, the Spirit Specialist, and this is the accompanying video for the World Wide Whisky blind tasting box set that I put together in advance of World Whisky Day, which is celebrated this year on Saturday the 21st of May. So last night we had a live tasting online in which we went through. Now my intention was to cleverly edit that video so that the people that were on the call basically weren't shown, and I'd be able to kind of give you the equivalent presentation without people talking over the top of it, which failed miserably because they weren't behaving themselves. It got a little bit worse towards the end of it. So what I've decided to do is basically record over the presentation that I showed without any interruptions from anybody else. So I'm recording this on the morning of World Whisky Day, but you don't have to drink all 6 in one go. They have lids, so you don't have to drink everything in the bottle either if you want to go back to them. So what I will do is, in the video notes, I will also put the timings of each individual dram, so that if you do want maybe a couple of one evening and then come back to the rest later on, you don't have to watch through the whole video or at least skim through it. You'll be able to jump to each specific dram, in which I will tell you where they came from and also a bit of background information about the individual distillery. Now, in the box, there was an envelope which has the answers in, so you don't even have to watch this video if you don't want to. But there was also the sticker that gave you 3 options per sample, just to kind of narrow things down rather than you having to guess from the entire world as where it's from. But the countries that were involved in those guesses, all of them do produce whiskey in some form or another. So they are genuine whiskey producing countries. So the first one, and if you want to pause it whenever we get to this screen with the number on so that you can have your sample, probably the best way of doing it. I'm not going to hang around and wait for a little bit while you drink. Pause it, have your sample, try it, see what you think. The most important thing is, do I like it or not? And that is I as in you, not me personally. I like all of them, otherwise I wouldn't be selling them. But just kind of see what you think. The point of doing this blind is to not have any preconceptions, knowing where it's from already. So your options for the blind sample number 1 was, is it from Israel? Is it from Sweden? Or is it from New Zealand? Now pause here, try the whiskey, see what you think, jot down what you think your guess is, because I'm about to narrow them down to the final answer in 3, 2, and 1. Right, so dram number 1 is not from Israel. Narrows it down to Sweden and New Zealand. And out of the 2, it is not from New Zealand. This is indeed a Swedish single malt. And the really well-known distillery from Sweden is Mackmyra. And the sample is Mackmyra Björksav. Now, Mackmyra was created in 1998 by 8 friends who all worked at the Swedish Royal Institute of Technology, who used to go on annual ski trips. And one year they all took a bottle of whiskey with them each. They put them on the table and realised that they were all Scotch. And they suddenly realised that there isn't actually any Swedish whiskey available. So they decided to set up a Swedish distillery. So Mackmyra itself is named after a small village where the distillery is set, near a place called Valvo, which is southeast of a town called Gävle. Now, they worked for about 4 years on various recipes and production techniques before building the main distillery. Well, it opened in 2002. That is the original distillery. You'll notice it says 1999 on the top there. That's when they started building it, but they actually started production in 2002. All the ingredients for distilling the spirit, with the exception of the yeast, is sourced within 75 miles of the original distillery. Now, in 2011, they opened a second distillery named Gravity, which was 6 miles away. Now, this is a really interesting building. It's 35 meters high, there's 7 floors, and essentially it uses, as the name suggests, gravity to move everything down through the whiskey making process. So essentially, barley goes in the top and whiskey comes out the bottom. It saves about 45% less energy than the original distillery, and they are working on saving even more costs. But it's a very, very clever kind of design, very Scandinavian design, to reduce the costs of production, reduce the energy, but also increase the efficiency as well. The master blender was this lady, Angela D'Orazio. She was previously a brand ambassador for Glenmorangie. She joined Mackmyra as part of their tasting panel in 2002, and it became pretty clear that she was head and shoulders above everybody else on the team in terms of picking up that subtleties within each flavour, the blending process as well. So in 2004, she was the full-time master blender and essentially the figurehead for Mackmyra. However, she actually left Macmira this year. There is somebody taking over whose name I can't remember. It's more of a team based rather than her being the figurehead. But Macmira itself is somewhat experimental, using her skills. So they do have a core range. The Mac is the introduction. You've got Svensk X, Svensk Rök on there, which is their Swedish Oak and Swedish Smoke versions. But they also do a lot of other kind of one-offs, limited runs, single cast bottlings, all sorts of things like that. Now, this year they are actually in the process of doing a bit of a streamlining, and not necessarily a rebranding, but they are streamlining their ranges. So we are seeing the last of what they call the seasonal releases and their moments. They will no longer be available. There will be sort of small batch bottlings out every now and again, but certainly not as many as there have been in the last few years. So the Björksav, which is the one that you're trying, is one of the last. It was essentially the penultimate. It came out last year. The last one, Limousin, has just been released this year. And Björksav is trying to evoke the feeling of spring. And the reason for that is that Björksav is Swedish for birch sap. So this is a 3 or 4 week window around March time when trees are tapped. So a wooden plug like that or a metal tube is kind of hammered into the tree. The sap runs out. It damages the tree ever so slightly, but that does regrow back. So we are not killing trees here in order to get the sap. It is a very natural process. And birch sap is excellent at making wine. Light, floral, slightly fruity, but it really is that kind of like delicately soft floral note that really, really comes through. So what Macmira have done with their whiskey is they've used a combination of casks, which includes barrels that have previously held birch sap wine. So as you can see here, we have 30% ex-bourbon casks, 24% ex-Oloroso sherry casks, 20% birch sap wine casks, 18% of casks that have been seasoned with sherries but not Oloroso. So there is like a variety of different sherries that have been used, and then 8% casks that are made from purely Swedish oak. Björksav is bottled 46.1%. There's no chill filtration. There's no colouring. I really like it as a light, soft. It really is a very spring-like whiskey. It's absolutely delicious. It works very well in a highball as well. And it's a really good kind of introduction to what Macmira are able to do. So that is your first whiskey. Prices will be given at the end. So I'm going to do a slight pause if you want, and you can start working on your second dram. Oh, I better give you the options, shouldn't I? So while you're trying it, these were the 3 options that were given. Is it from Japan? Is it from Mexico? Or is it from Ireland? I take a swig of my coffee, and so I will give you the answers in 3, 2, 1. So, blind dram number 2 is not Japanese. Now, Mexico do a really, really interesting corn whiskey, but this is not it. It is not from Mexico. This is, in fact, an Irish whiskey, and this is Writer's Tears Copper Pot. Now, you might have seen on some Irish whiskey something called pot still whiskey, and that might then evoke that classic whiskey still shape, the pot still, the bulbous bottom, the swan neck running over the top. But pot still whiskies, in terms of Irish whiskey, aren't necessarily referring to the still that are being used. A lot of Irish whiskey is made with these types of stills. They use column stills as well. But pot still whiskey is actually a term that's used for whiskies that are made with not only malted barley, but also unmalted barley, what's also known as green barley. So basically, kind of taken off the stem, as it were, and it's thrown into the still along with malted barley that's gone through the milling and mashing fermentation process as well. So it offers a slightly oily texture and a juicy fruitiness. I kind of liken it to black currants as well, but it's a very distinctive flavour that's kind of unique to Ireland. Now, Irish whiskey will also go on about triple distillation, and some places will tell you this is what makes Irish whiskey Irish whiskey. Nowhere else does it. There are 1 or 2 Scotch whisky distilleries that do it, but yes, as a sweeping generalisation, Scotch whisky and most other whiskies around the world tend to be double distilled. Irish tends to be triple distilled. But in terms of flavour, that juiciness, that unique flavour profile that Irish whiskies get is from the unmalted barley, not necessarily the triple distillation. A third run of distillation can kind of strip out some of the flavours as well. So yes, it does make Irish whiskey lighter, and although I hate the term, some people say smoother. Not necessarily smoother, it is a lighter texture because of the extra distillation. But the flavour of it, the unique flavour of Irish, is very much due to this use of unmalted barley. So, Writer's Tears is a brand that was started by Walsh Whisky in 2009. Walsh Whisky itself was set up in 2004, and it actually stemmed from, they are called the Walsh, I can't remember what the first names are, it's completely gone out of my head, but they were a couple that were running a bed and breakfast, and they were making a very popular, essentially a hot toddy with Irish whiskey. And they used that as a branding. They set up Walsh Whisky in 2004. Writer's Tears was a brand that they then set up in 2009. Now, this is their distillery, which is in Southeast Ireland. However, the distillery only started distilling in March 2016. So Writer's Tears as a brand has been sourcing its whiskies from somewhere else. And this is actually quite common in Irish whiskey. There are lots of new Irish distilleries opening up. Irish whiskey is becoming more and more popular recently, and there's a bit of a flood in the market of new distilleries. But they are brands almost that have been set up a bit like gin, where the whiskies that are being produced are actually at other distilleries under their brand name while they are waiting for their own stocks to mature. So Writer's Tears will have increasingly more whiskey made by Walsh itself. But at the moment, Writer's Tears uses whiskies that's produced at the Middleton distillery. And if you look at the screen closely, there's that massive still that's on the left-hand side. But on the right, you'll see just above the door a name that you might have heard of in terms of Irish whiskies, Jameson's. Middleton is the distillery that produces Jameson's, and they do make a lot of whiskies for other Irish brands that make it sound like it's from a different distillery. Now, this is no problem at all. I don't have an issue with this because ultimately it's what the whiskey itself tastes like. And what we have with Writer's Tears, they do have a single malt version. They do have a pure pot still version. But this particular one, the copper pot, is a combination of about 40% of the pot still whiskey that uses unmalted barley and 60% of single malt whiskey, all matured in ex-bourbon barrels. So that's what gives you a kind of slightly lighter character along with that triple distillation, but you get a lot of kind of apple, orchard fruits. There's a little bit of kind of vanilla cream in there, which is coming from the ex-bourbon casks, like light sweet ginger honeycomb. It's a very, very easy drinking bottle. Now, to be absolutely brutally honest, I really wish this was at 43, 46%. I love the flavour profile of this, but it's almost a little bit too easy to drink. If they had a bottling at 46%, I think it would be even better. But at the moment, there doesn't appear to be one out there in the market. But I still think this is absolutely brilliant. Okay, so let's move on to our third blind dram. The options for this. Is it from Australia? Is it from Finland? Or is it from India? I'll give you a second if you want to pause it, and then I will give you the answers. In 3, 2, 1. So, dram number 3 is not from Finland, although there is a very good whiskey that's being made there from Kiro. So, Australia or India? Those of you that are thinking it was India, sadly, I'm afraid you're incorrect. This is an Australian single malt, and this is Morris, Australian single malt whiskey. So Morris is a winery that's on the border of Victoria and New South Wales, right down in the southeast of Australia, halfway between Melbourne and Sydney. It's a very highly regarded wine producer that's been operating since 1859, and it's probably better known for its fortified wines, ports, things like that. It nearly closed down in 2016. The owners at the time, Pernod Ricard, were finding it surplus to requirements, and it basically said, we are going to close it down. But another wine conglomerate based in Australia did buy it, and it is now still operational in full. And it was with some surprise that they launched a single malt whiskey in June of 2021, because when it was under threat of closure from Pernod Ricard, this is when they were actually beginning this process of making whiskies themselves. So they had the help of a gentleman called John McDougall, who was the master distiller formerly of Balvenie, Laphroaig and Springbank, and a distillery consultant named Jim Swan. Now, Dr. Jim Swan is well known with regards to helping new distilleries, particularly new distilleries that would end up releasing something called STR whiskies. Now, these were red wine barrels that were shaved, toasted, and recharred. They gave you a lot of really good berry fruit flavours and meant that they could use red wine casks that, prior to doing the shaving, toasting, recharring process, would normally end up being too dry, too tannic. But if you shave it and then rechar it, you actually end up getting the fruity flavours without that dry note to it. And it meant that casks that otherwise weren't normally used for whiskey maturation could be used at normally a cheaper cost as well. Now, Morris have the advantage of they were making red wines. They had these fortified wine barrels and things like that as well. So, in order to do fortification of wines, to make ports and things like that, you actually need a base spirit to add to those wines. And they already had their own still, which is this still here, installed in 1941. So what they did was they refurbed it, completely revitalised it, tweaked it slightly so it was able to actually produce a whiskey of some form or another, and they renamed it Aurora based on the tale of Sleeping Beauty because it had been asleep and they'd woken it up, and it was back up and running. So distillation commenced in 2016, that year where they nearly closed down, and it uses 100% Australian barley. The spirits then matured in a combination of American and French oak barrels that have previously held either Shiraz or Cabernet Sauvignon wines from a variety of Australian producers in that southeast area. And then with the case of the signature, it's then finished for about 6 months or so in barrels that have previously held Morris's own fortified wines. So it's essentially a port finish. But what you have is that when I put this on tasting last night, this really kind of threw people because tasting it blind, and I don't know if it had the same effect to you trying it. People weren't expecting the slightly spiciness. There is a touch of tannin in there, and this is because it's been matured in red wine barrels. It's not sherry casks, it's not bourbon casks, it's not got those standard flavors that you would expect from maturations in those type of casks. The red wine element takes it in a completely different direction, and then you kind of get that slightly burnt sweetness from the finishing off in what is the equivalent of port barrels as well. It's a really, really distinctive, really unusual whiskey. I appreciate it's not for everybody, but I think it's absolutely fantastic because it's so unusual. Oops, I should have gone to. I thought I had another screen after that. They do have another one that's a muscat finish. I have tried that. It's a little bit too sweet, so I only have the signature in. But I think this is an incredibly interesting, really unusual whiskey, and I love it because of that. Hopefully you feel the same, but having had the conversations last night, I absolutely appreciate this isn't necessarily for everybody. Okay, now we'll move on to number 4. And your options for this while you're trying it is this from Wales? Is it from France? Or is it from the US of A? Give you a second before I give you the answers. In 3, 2, 1. So, this particular whiskey is not from France. Now, Wales is Penderyn. I think that's still the only distillery that's operational in Wales. Probably not. I'm sure there's some others that have opened recently, but Penderyn is absolutely the best known whiskey. But if you are a bit of a whiskey drinker, if you're kind of used to drinking whiskies, if you've had bourbons and American whiskies and things like that, you probably would have picked up the notes that are classical to that particular country. This is an American whiskey. And this is Uncle Nearest. And this has literally been officially launched in the UK in the last month. It has been available for quite a while. There have been a few places in the UK selling it, but they've kind of got it through various means, not official routes. There is now a UK distributor for this. But there is a really important story behind this that has to be shared because this involves one of the biggest brands of whiskies in the world. So, Uncle Nearest was the nickname of this gentleman, Nathan Green, who was a slave from West Africa who, in the early to mid 1800s, was shipped from his homeland to the home of Reverend Dan Call in Lynchburg, Tennessee. So this picture of Dan on the left, I think that is actually supposed to be a beard rather than a ruff around his neck. And there is a picture on the right of him circled, stood in front of his quite impressive plantation house. Now, he was a preacher, but he also operated a side hustle of a small distillery not far from his house. And Nathan ended up working in that distillery and brought across with him a technique of filtration through charcoal. They would use it in Africa to filter the water to make it drinkable, but he used that to improve the flavour of the whiskey by filtering it through, at the time, maple charcoal. So it became an incredibly popular whiskey. And there was a young white boy named Jasper who, at the age of about 12, got in touch with the Reverend and was asking for work. So Dan ended up sending him to the distillery to help out there as a young child. He became fascinated with what Nathan Green was doing and became really keen in the whiskey making process. So he then begged the Reverend to let him work with Uncle Nearest himself. So he began working as essentially a salesman for the local community. Now, in 1865, Nathan Green became a free man after the 13th Amendment was passed, and shortly after that, Jasper, still at a relatively young age, purchased the distillery from Reverend Call and decided to rename it after himself. This is Jasper. Jasper decided that he was actually going to use the name that, not his real first name, but the nickname that he was given by his customers, which he thought sounded much better with his surname. So his surname was Daniel, and the nickname that he was given was Jack. So this is world famous Jack Daniel. Now, at the time of reopening the distillery after buying it from Dan Call, he asked Nathan Green to be the distillery's first master distiller, which Uncle Nearest accepted, and he continued until his retirement in around 1888. So, Jack Daniels, we have all heard of it. However, if you were to go and visit the Jack Daniels distillery, up to about 2016, there would be no mention of Nathan Green whatsoever. There is, in fact, a biography about Jack Daniels in 1967 that talks about the fact that Dan Call was the inspiration and the teacher for Jack Daniel, and he was the one that ended up influencing the distillery. If it wasn't for Dan Call, there wouldn't be a Jack Daniels distillery, which isn't strictly true because it's pretty damn clear now from historical records that Nathan Green was the clear influence on Jack Daniels. And basically, if it wasn't for Uncle Nearest, there wouldn't be a Jack Daniels. Now, if you do any Googling on Jack Daniels and Nathan Green, you'll very often see this particular image. And in some places, they will say, this is a picture of Jack, all right, and Nathan Green on the left. Now, Nathan Green was about 40 years older than Jack Daniels, so this is not actually strictly the case. But he is sat next to Nathan Green's son. And if we go back to that picture, at this point in time, it's very, very unusual to see pictures of white and black men together. Now, in these really difficult times that we're in at the moment, particularly over in America, of racial equality and inequality, it was quite sad to find out that the story of Nathan Green was essentially ignored and, for want of a better word, completely whitewashed. And it wasn't until 2016 that Brown-Forman admitted publicly that, yes, Nathan Green was the influence of Jack Daniels, not Dan Call, as they kept saying. Now, this lady here is a writer called Fawn Weaver, who's also an historian, and she found out about the Nathan Green story. She read about it after Brown-Forman started talking about it. But even when she went to visit the distillery to do some research, the tours would still talk about Dan Call being the influence, and Nathan Green was still forgotten about. So she's been on a bit of a crusade to get the true story about Nathan Green, stroke Uncle Nearest, out into the public. And in 2017, they launched a whiskey under the Uncle Nearest name that was sourcing whiskies from other distilleries in the Tennessee area with a view of opening their own distillery to make actual Uncle Nearest whiskey. And this is where we are now. We have a distillery that opened in September 2019. The Nearest Green Distillery in Shelbyville, Tennessee. The business is owned by Fawn Weaver. There are actually some descendants of Nathan Green himself that work at the distillery. And at the moment, it is the only distillery in America that is both black and female owned. So this is really groundbreaking in the terms of the industry itself. So, what you've been sampling is the Uncle Nearest 1884. The 1856, which was a 100 proof, 50% ABV bottling, was the first one that came out. But the 1884 is a small batch, bottled at 46.5% ABV, which is a marriage of 8 to 15-year-old corn and rye spirit, which could be called a bourbon if they wanted to, but it's undergone the Lincoln County process, which has been filtered through maple charcoal, which Jack Daniels is so famous for. Now, I find this really fruity. I get a lot of tropical flavours from it. Makes a fantastic old-fashioned because it already has a bit of inherent sweetness. But more importantly is the story. I think it's absolutely fantastic liquid. This is still sourced, but we will find bottlings coming out in the next few years that are going to have Nearest Green Distillery's own spirit inside it. But it tastes great, but the story behind this is something that absolutely needs to be shared as far and wide as possible. Now, let's move on to blind dram number 5. And your options here are, is this a whiskey from Canada? Is this a whiskey from Taiwan? Or is it from England? I shall pause, so you can pause the video and try it, and then I will give the answers. In 3, 2, 1. So, last night when we were doing the tasting, there were a lot of people that were absolutely convinced this was from Taiwan. But unfortunately, it is not. It is very similar to Cavalan, particularly the heavily sherried Cavalans that they do, but it's not Cavalan. So this could be Canadian, which can be quite sweet, or it could be English. And it is English, it's not Canadian. This is a bottling from the English Whisky Company. This is actually quite a special bottling, and I shall tell you why in a minute. But let me tell you about the English Whisky Company itself. It's in Norfolk. It's in a place called Roundham. It's about 35 minutes southwest of Norwich. And it was set up in 2006. It was the first whisky distillery to be based in England for just over 100 years. It opened in 2006. The last distillery to be operational in England was in this building. It was the Lee Valley Distillery, but that closed down in 1905. It was founded by Andrew and James Nelstrop. James is his father, Andrew's father, and they were part of generations of arable farmers that were looking to diversify, because farming, as you're probably aware over recent years, is not the most profitable business. It's very, very difficult to maintain getting any kind of income, and they were basically looking for some kind of new venture that would give them something different to do. And there are more and more farmers now that are getting into whiskey production or spirit production in some form or another. Now, initially, Ian Henderson, this gentleman who was previously the master distiller of Lefroy, went on board to oversee operations. He was joined a couple of years later in 2008 by this guy, David Fitt, who was a master brewer with Green King. He mentored with Ian for a few years before Ian retired, and David is now fully in charge of the operation. James sadly passed away in 2014, but Andrew still runs the business. He's still incredibly passionate. It is fully independent still, and he very much is the figurehead of it. Now, at the moment, they have a core range available, the original and the smoky, and they also have some small batch releases of various styles. Now, the oldest vintage bottling that they have was released last year, which is an 11-year-old. Now, you might think, well, hang on, if it was set up in 2006, there must be older stock than 11-year-old, and there is. But David is very forthright and very honest, and he has said to me personally, as well as during other discussions as well, that the very early stuff that was made by the English Whisky Company isn't actually that good. Ian was sort of treading water. He was ready to retire. It's almost like his heart was just not quite in it. So they were making whiskey, but it has to be said that the early bottlings from the English Whisky Company, particularly with this packaging, where I've had people in my previous role as a distributor for it, retailers turned around and went, I'm not listing it because it looks like the EDL have bottled it. It wasn't great stock. And it's a bit of a shame because the really early stuff they've got sadly isn't quite up to scratch as it is now. And David basically came on board and revitalized it and said, we almost have to start again. So that is why at the moment, the oldest bottling is an 11-year-old. Pretty much anything from kind of pre-2010, that kind of thing is, pre-2010 is not great. Once we get to 2010 onwards, we really start to get into what is a house style, and the quality is absolutely fantastic. Now, this particular sample that you have tried is an exclusive bottling for the Rolls-Royce Enthusiast Club, the RREC, but they're also known as the International Club for Rolls-Royce and Bentley Enthusiasts as well. And this was a single cask bottling that was bottled exclusively for them. It's named Hunt House Number 1, and Hunt House is the HQ for the RREC. 4 cask samples were given to the directors of the club, along with a couple of representatives from the distillery. They tried them. They selected one, which would then be bottled. So what we have here is a new make spirit being filled into a 200-litre ex-bourbon cask sourced from Jim Beam, the 31st of July 2014, which was then disgorged on the 6th of November 2018 and transferred into a barrel that had been seasoned for about 3 or 4 years with Pedro Jimenez sherry, really rich, dark, fruity sherry, to increase those dark fruit characters. It was disgorged in November 2021 for bottling, which makes it a 7-year-old. There's no colour, there's no chill filtration, and there are only 270 bottles in existence. The exclusive retailer for this particular bottle was yours truly. You can only get this bottle through me, and you could only get it if you were a member of the Rolls-Royce Enthusiast Club. However, there still appear to be some bottles available. There weren't as many members as we kind of hoped that were going to pick this bottling up. We thought it was going to be snapped up, and unfortunately, there are still some left. So right at this point in time, this is available to the public kind of under the counter through me. So if you are liking this, then it is available. Let me know, and I will be able to sort a bottle out for you. Because there is an argument to say there is also the collectability on this, due to the fact it's a single cask, the fact it's an exclusive, and also for Rolls-Royce owners as well. So if you've got a Rolls, you need a couple of bottles of this. I absolutely love this. I love that really dark, rich, fruity character to it. It's bottled at 57% as well. It's not cask strength. They have diluted it very slightly, but it still drinks incredibly well at that higher ABV. If you do want to add some water, it will open it out even more. It changes it. It doesn't make it better, but it does make it even more interesting as well. Now, the prices will be at the end, but I do highly recommend this if you're looking for something really special. The bottle is also absolutely beautiful. It's in one of their special decanter bottles, which tend to be slightly more expensive. And, you know, I think this is an absolute belter. So, the final one, and this is where we get into our smoky element. I don't want to go too overboard, but I did want to put a smoky element on. This is one that's a little bit different, however, of which you'll find out in a minute. Your options are, is this from Denmark? Is this from Italy? Or is this from South Africa? So I'll give you a second. You can pause it. You can try it. See what you think. Make your guesses. And then I will give you the answer in 3, 2, 1. Now, there was some discussion last night about the fact that quite a few people were thinking this is South Africa. And this is because there is a South African single malt whiskey called Three Ships, which is actually lightly peated. So there is a bit of smokiness on, but it's not as smoky as this particular one. So this is not the South African Three Ships, which is peatier than most people expect when they try it. So this is either from Denmark or Italy. And there is a couple of Italian whiskies out there, but the ones I've come across are not peated. So this is actually a Danish whiskey. So let me tell you about Stauning Danish whiskey. This is a distillery on the western part of Jutland. Stauning is the name of the village where it's based. It was founded in 2005 by 9 friends who were really passionate about whiskey and wanting to get into whiskey making, but had no previous experience. So of those friends, we have a doctor, a teacher, a helicopter pilot, 4 engineers, and also a butcher. And the butcher was able to acquire a former abattoir, which is behind them in that picture, which helped them start operations on quite a small scale. The engineering element of that team ended up adapting a number of pieces of machinery in order to help them. So it was an old meat mincer that was basically adapted to do the milling of the barley. They used the butcher's old cauldron to do malting. It's mainly rye. They do use, it's about 10% barley, but the predominant grain that they use is rye. About 90% of their production is rye whiskey based. And they wanted initially to emulate smoky whiskies from Ireland. So they were using peat, and I will get onto where that peat is sourced from, to have a smoky character to it. There's a very well-known whiskey writer named Jim Murray, who almost by accident came across them at a meeting, tried some of their whiskey, likened it to Ardbeg of the 1970s, which is really high praise indeed. And as a result, they decided that actually this is working for us. We need to escalate production. So in 2007, they moved to a farm about 1.5 kilometers away from the original abattoir. And as the whiskies have grown and become more popular, they ended up expanding even further. So you see that building there. You'll see it much, much smaller on the right-hand side, dwarfed by a purpose-built distillery that opened in 2018. It's a really impressive unit. Everything is done on site. The malting, the milling, the mashing, the fermentation, the distillation, even the dunnage warehouse for maturation as well. Now, rather than a couple of big stills, they actually have what they call pod stills. So there are 24 stills that hold about 2,000 litres of liquid. They're direct fired by gas. And these little stills mean that they can actually kind of play around with certain things and do a little bit of experimentation on a couple of stills while they're doing their core ranges on the rest. As I say, everything is done on site, including the malting process, and they do things very, very differently. This is almost unique. This was purpose-built for malting. So to do the malting process, you steep barley, or in this case rye, with water to start to sprout it, and then you have to dry that as quickly as possible. Now, what tends to happen is you put it on a stone floor, you set fire to something underneath to heat that stone. The smoke can permeate through the stone into the grain, but you also need to turn it so that it doesn't get too hot, because it is at risk of exploding if it gets too hot underneath and it's wet on the above, and you want to dry it as evenly as possible. This is a really, really clever piece of kit that was purpose-built, where you have a big trough which the grain sits in, and then this arm basically goes up and down on a track, and you have rotating blades that continually turn the barley to keep it drying at an even keel. So for a couple of days, this track runs up and down and up and down, and it's continually moving and continually turning, rather than having people doing it with big shovels. It's an amazing piece of kit, and to see it in action, it's a fantastic piece of engineering as well. So, in terms of the peat, this is actually sourced from a museum. It's about 90 kilometres away, called the Klusterland Museum, and it's on the bank of a peat bog called the Bolling Bog. So what they do is they cut the peat from the banks of the bog and also inside it as well. So this is really intense, dark, very dirty kind of green peat. It introduces a really interesting kind of smokiness. They also use heather, which is sourced from the fjord, which the distillery itself is on the banks of. So you have dark, dirty peat, really ancient peat, as well as heather, which is introducing a floral note, to create a smoky rye whiskey, which has got loads going on for it. For some people, almost too much. You've got the smoke element, you've got that slightly sour note of the rye, you've got incredible depth and complexity. There is a lot going on with this particular whiskey. Now, the range from Stoughton itself is well worth checking out. They have the rye on its own, which is unpeated but absolutely delicious, makes a stunning old-fashioned cocktail. Chaos is a combination of their smoked rye, the standard rye, and also the malted barley whiskey that they do produce, which isn't available separately on its own. That goes into the Chaos. And then they have a couple of slightly unusual finishes. Stoughton Bastard, brilliantly named, is finished off in mezcal casks. So mezcal is the agave spirit of which tequila is part of mezcal. So tequila is a very specific part of the mezcal category, which is agave-based. Mezcals tend to be slightly kind of smokier, pepperier than tequila would be, but it's still earthy. It's still got a nice bit of pepperiness that works really well with that rye whiskey. El Clasico is their rye whiskey that's been finished in casks that have previously held red sweet vermouth. So it's essentially a Manhattan cocktail with not quite as much vermouth in. It's absolutely fantastic. If you like a Manhattan, you will absolutely love this. So that is the end of that. And hopefully in that tasting, there'll be some bottles that you do actually want to buy. So if you did, here is the pricing for it. The Magnera Björksav is $59.99. And if you're also interested in the Limousin, which is the last of their seasonal releases, which was finished in cognac casks, deeper, slightly spicier than the Björksav. If you like the Björksav, but you wanted a little, say, oomph to it, a bit more richness, then the Limousin, which I also have in stock, is well worth looking at. That's also $59.99. The Writer's Tears Copper Pot still is $34.99. The Morris Signature is $54.99, as is the Uncle Nearest. I don't know why I've written 1885, because it's 1884. The English Rolls-Royce Enthusiasts Club exclusive single cask bottling is $89.99 a bottle. And I don't have many of them left. You can only get it at the moment from me. And if you like the Stoughton Smoked Rye, that is $76.99. I do also have the Bastard and the El Clasico in. I highly recommend having a look at those too. So that is it. Hopefully you've enjoyed them. Hopefully you've discovered some whiskies that you may not already even looked at because of where they were from. And it's the fun part of doing these blind tastings is, like I say, it removes all these preconceptions and really forces you to look at the whiskey itself, the liquid. What does it taste like? What does it smell like? Do I like it? Irrespective of what the bottle looks like, where it's come from, that sort of thing. So thank you for buying the pack. Let me know your thoughts. I'd be really interested to see what you thought of it. Let me know if this video works for you. It's the first time I've done any of these kind of tasting boxes where it's had an accompanying video for people to watch along with. So any kind of feedback would be very much appreciated. Thank you again, and hopefully I will see you in the shop or hear from you very, very soon.